I think if we go back to the previous hearings a few months back when Mark Zuckerberg was on, which you just showed, the senators showed a distinct lack of knowledge of how the internet business model works. And I think this time we hope to see, much more deeper questioning about regulatory issues. And we at Global Data, we think this is the beginning of a huge regulatory wave against the big social networks.
Cyrus, we've heard a lot about the potential for regulation around privacy, the possibility of implementing similar rules here in the United States as GDPR in Europe. What do you think the most likely regulation is outside of GDPR-style privacy regulation?
Yeah, I think there's a number of regulatory areas like copyright, obstruction of justice, tax avoidance, data privacy, and so on. But this Senate hearing is concentrated on election manipulation and possible biased news against the US president, against conservative policies. So I think in the short term, there's two possible outcomes in terms of regulation. The first is that the Senate or the regulators in America could ask Facebook, Twitter, and Google to open up their algorithms so that outside authorities can check whether there's any bias in them, for transparency purposes.
It's like asking to see the formula for Coca-Cola, Cyrus. You think there's any way in the world that those companies, even if requested, would ever do that?
Well, they might do that if the disclosure is only to the US government and not to the public. But they're unlikely to do that. So I accept your point. They're unlikely to do that. The second option is that they get regulated as a publisher. Now, remember, social networks like Facebook and Twitter, to some extent Google, have always said they're content-neutral platforms. They're aggregation platforms. They show no bias. But the very fact that they have an algorithm which targets news and targets search to their users means that they do curate content, and therefore there is a very strong argument regulators can make that they should be regulated like publishers, like CNBC is regulated. And that imposes enormous compliance costs on people like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, because then they have to fact-check their work. Their news has to be less biased than it is, whether inadvertently or on purpose. So those are the two short-term outcomes.
Well, Cyrus, Facebook and Twitter have made it very clear that they're not media companies. They've tried very hard to define themselves as technology companies, and they are not publishing their own news. They are allowing other publishers to share on their platform. It seems like a lot of this comes down to this debate about whether they're media companies or tech companies.
Yes, and I think now is the right time to have that debate, because I think you can argue both ways. You can argue that a publisher curates news and Facebook's algorithms act as an automated curator. But really, why are we having this hearing? The reason we're having this hearing is because social media companies for years have have done a lot of good, but they've also brought about a lot of social ills. And one of them is election manipulation. The very result of the US election, the greatest democracy in the world, is potentially in doubt. And the whole world is watching to see the validity of these results. So this is a question that we cannot just ignore. And in the past, regulators have allowed social networks to get away with all these social ills, but this one they simply can't ignore.
Well, Cyrus, to Julia's point, I think that is the most important thing that maybe come out of these hearings, which is, are they media companies or not? Because to your point as well, that comes with a lot of negativity, a lot of positives, but you're also going to get regulated by many of the agencies in Washington, D.C., where they will sit today. They continue to push into original content. They are streaming live video.
Yep.
Do you believe that Twitter and Facebook and maybe even Google are now, at their core, quote, media companies that should be regulated? Yes or no?
I do. Yes, I do. In the longer term, I think there's probably a better solution. I'm not sure it'll come from US regulators. It might come from European regulators or perhaps Chinese regulators. And that is that right now the biggest companies in the world are Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, these kind of companies. And they're big because they have internet ecosystems that control three things. They control user data. They put that user data on clouds that they own so that no other competitors can get access to that data. And then they control the user interface, the Facebook application or WhatsApp or Instagram or whatever it is. And in future, regulators may start to say, look, that data doesn't belong to Facebook. It belongs to the user. So the user should control who has rights to that, and that will give rise to something we call decentralized apps. So instead of a strong internet ecosystem that Facebook currently has, because it controls all these three things, we might move to a system where Facebook has to ask permission from the user to use its data and cannot store that data on its own cloud. But that's many years away.